Hello and welcome to the second in a series of talks for the University of Chicago uh, Alumni U online seminar, America's Founding Revisited. I'm George Van Cleve, here the facilitator for this course, and the subject of my talk today is American expansion and its foes. After the war, many Americans wanted to expand westward and to expand America's foreign trade as well. But even before the war was over, the foes of American expansion began efforts to prevent it from occurring. And as we'll see, the Confederation was powerless to respond to these efforts, primarily for political reasons. This talk today will discuss three main aspects of expansion: foreign trade, Western settlement, and the Spanish Treaty impasse. Now, foreign trade is a complex subject, and the amount of time I have available today will not allow me to discuss it in enormous detail. But let me make the following series of main points about it. The United States, after the war, the Confederation government took a radical position about foreign trade. It advocated free trade, which, believe it or not, at the time was a minority position. Adam Smith had recently published his classic Wealth of Nations, but in fact most governments believed that trade should be controlled, and controlled in the political, military, and economic interests of the government, which usually meant that trade was not free, but in fact was controlled within either empires or military alliances of one form or another. Now, the Confederation was able to make a few treaties under its approach to trade with countries such as Prussia, Sweden, the Netherlands, and France. But these treaties actually had very little effect on the course of trade, and most of the major trading countries and trading areas of the world remained closed to American trade during this period. Meanwhile, the European powers imposed major new restrictions on American trade. Great Britain imposed trade restrictions even before the definitive Treaty of Peace was signed. In 1783, Britain closed its West Indian colonies to American ships, sailors, and it also barred many major American exports to them, such as fish. Now, these trade restrictions had very large effects, especially in New England, because New England was the home of the so-called carrying trade, that is, the shipping trade in the United States, and also shipbuilding was a major element of its economy as well. So the British restrictions, as Britain well knew, had especially large impacts on New England, but much smaller impacts on places such as South Carolina, which exported using potentially shipping from other countries and exported crops that might not be affected by the British trade restrictions. John Adams, who was America's ambassador in Britain, understood that Britain had been able to impose these restrictions because of American disunity, and so he advocated that Congress be given the power, or the states combine in one form or another, to retaliate against the restrictions. That did not happen. During this period, the states were unable to agree on common trade restrictions. Efforts by individual states such as Massachusetts to impose retaliatory trade restrictions were essentially opportunities for other states to take advantage of the Massachusetts restrictions, for example, by inviting trade to their ports. So Massachusetts, after a relatively short period of time, gave up on its efforts of retaliation. Other states imposed protectionist duties to protect their local industries and to retaliate. These also had little effect on trade restrictions. The In 1784, both the French and the Spanish imposed new trade restrictions. Spain closed the Mississippi River to American commerce, and we'll talk about that major issue later in this talk. France imposed restrictions on wheat and flour exports, which were very important to the mid-Atlantic states, and also barred imports to the United States of sugar from its Caribbean colonies. Again, a major import commodity for the United States. Now, Congress proposed that it be given, the Confederation be given, new trade retaliation powers in 1784. The states never agreed to give Congress and the Confederation those powers. Not long after Congress's proposal, many people decided that it wasn't going to work even if it had been agreed to, and so more radical proposals were made. These proposals, which would have involved the ability for the Confederation to control both domestic and foreign commerce and to tax commerce, were so divisive along purely sectional grounds that Congress never even formally made this proposal to the states. And efforts in some states, such as Virginia, to get the state to agree to provide such powers to Congress also failed. So during this period, the United States faced major new trade restrictions. The Confederation and the states were unable to do anything about them because they could not agree on the kinds of retaliation that should take place. And that lack of agreement was largely due to sectional economics and politics. One result of Virginia's consideration was the proposal for the Annapolis Convention, which I can't talk about in detail today, although it's important to understand it. But let me just make two basic points. First of all, the states had 6 months to decide whether or not to attend the convention, but only 3 states agreed to send full delegations to the convention. No New England state attended. None of the southern states, except Virginia, attended. And in fact, Maryland, the host state, did not send a delegation. And although the Annapolis Convention recommended the Philadelphia Convention, that recommendation really had been a foregone conclusion before it ever met. And it had, as we'll see in a later talk, nothing whatsoever to do with why states either agreed to attend or opposed the Philadelphia Convention itself. So the Annapolis Convention, despite its conventional use as a genealogy to explain the Philadelphia Convention, actually had very little to do with the movement for the Philadelphia Convention. And we'll see what did in a later talk. So American trade was subject to restriction throughout this period. Now, the second major expansion issue that I want to talk about today, and a very politically fundamentally important expansion issue, is Western settlement. There was a flood of Western settlement after the end of the Revolutionary War, and everyone knew it was occurring. And in many cases, it was regarded as a political curse, and I'll explain why in a minute. An example would be Kentucky, the areas that are now Kentucky and Tennessee. These areas had extremely few Western white settlers in them as of 1780, and by 1790 they had nearly 100,000 white settlers and slaves, about 15,000 slaves, and they were as large as the areas, nearly as large as the areas of populations of Rhode Island and Delaware combined. And in Kentucky, this expansion occurred even though during the period that we're talking about and through 1790, roughly 1,500 Kentuckians were killed by Native Americans, which meant that a small but significant percentage of the population of Kentucky was actually killed during this period, and settlement continued, which gives you an idea of how powerful the Western settlement thrust was. Now, the settlement came from all parts of the United States, although the southwestern settlement, that is south of the Ohio River, very often came from the mid-Atlantic or southern states. And the New England immigration very often went to western areas of either Massachusetts, Vermont, upstate New York, western Pennsylvania. But New England lost 10% of its population during this period to immigration. And there was also substantial migration from the southern states. In New England, this was regarded as a political curse. Western immigrants weren't going to pay taxes in the older states. Western immigrants might very well either create new states or become allied with foreign governments. In either case, they would be adverse to the political interests of the original states. And finally, Western settlers might very well engage in wars with Native Americans into which the original states might be drawn against their will. So there was very, very serious misgiving in New England particularly, but also in some of the southern state leadership about the problem of Western immigration. Now the Confederation during this period did create the national domain by convincing states such as Virginia to cede their western land claims to the United States. But the Confederation was not able to develop a land policy that would effectively control the flood of western settlement, and it was not able to control any form or create any form of territorial government for the western states. There were several thousand illegal settlers on Confederation lands during this period, and the Confederation's very small army, a few hundred men, was unable to control settlement or to effectively control conflict between the settlers and Native Americans. Native Americans thought of the settlement as completely illegal and that whites were trespassers and could be dealt with violently if necessary. So the Confederation was unable to control the course of settlement. It also ducked the problem of territorial government completely, leaving settlers in effect to either create their own or have no government of any kind. Among other things, it did so because it was unable to deal with the problem of territorial slavery, which some congressmen had tried to deal with beginning as early as 1784, but which Congress found itself unwilling to take on until during the meeting of the Philadelphia Convention. In other words, when the Confederation was about to be put out of existence is the first time that that problem was actually squarely confronted in Congress. Now, Native Americans were able to resist white settlement, partially because they were receiving assistance from both Spain and Britain. Spain provided covert military assistance to the Creeks and other tribes who were opposing expansion in the Southwest. Spanish officials were instructed to lie about the fact that they were providing this kind of military assistance. Britain provided lands and covert military aid to tribes opposing expansion in the Northwest. And Britain also retained its forts, and the forts were important to the Native American tribes, both because they were a source, a really important source of income through the lucrative fur trade, which benefited British merchants as well, and provided funds that Native Americans could use to purchase weapons. But in addition, they provided a logistical base of operations for the tribes as they engaged in various forms of guerrilla warfare against Western settlers who crossed the Ohio. Now, in 1786, the tribes effectively blocked Confederation surveyors who were required to survey lands before the Confederation was legally authorized to sell them. That led Congress to triple the size of the Army, but it had no ability to pay the Army. So the tribes won, at least in the short term, a victory because Confederation surveying essentially stopped. That led the Confederation to make desperation land sales in 1787, which involved millions of acres that were sold for an effective price of 8 to 9 cents an acre. The minimum price required by law was $1 an acre, and at the time Massachusetts land sold for $20 to $30 an acre, to give you an idea of the enormous disparity between the millions of acres, sale price for millions of acres the Confederation actually sold, and other market values and its own political goals. Now, the Confederation raised less than $1 million for these land sales, and consequently, you can well imagine that this could never have retired the national debt, or even a significant fraction of it. And it was the best the Confederation could do in the way of land sales. There was also substantial Confederation conflict not only over land policy and over territorial government and territorial slavery, but also over military assistance to Western settlers. Virginia, in 1786, asked Congress to provide military assistance to its Kentucky settlers who were being increasingly attacked by Native Americans, and the Confederation politely and with a certain amount of equivocation refused to provide that military assistance. In return, Patrick Henry, who was the governor of Virginia at the time, threatened that the settlers and their states throughout the South would be inclined to leave the Confederation if they were not going to receive military protection from it, because he thought of that as one of the few benefits that the Confederation actually provided. So the Western settlement became an increasing strain on the Confederation, and there were very important sectional divisions, and the Virginia request for military assistance is a good example of that, within the Confederation government and within Congress over the use of military power to protect Western expansion. And essentially, the Confederation failed to control expansion or to protect expansion during this period. But expansion continued at a rapid pace despite that and despite Indian attacks. However, the expansion was much more powerful in the Southwest than it was in the Northwest into that is, across the Ohio. In effect, the South was gaining, from a sectional point of view, from the Confederation's lack of action, but at the same time it was causing important political strains in the South that the Confederation would not provide military assistance. Now, the final topic I want to talk to you about today is another aspect of Western expansion, and it involves the Spanish Treaty impasse. This is really one of the most interesting stories from this entire period, because Spain developed a very clever plan for dividing the Confederation government, and dividing it so badly that it was essentially at a permanent impasse over Western expansion policy. In 1784, Spain closed the Mississippi River to American trade. It had known before the Treaty of Peace was signed that Britain planned to grant navigation rights on the Mississippi River to the United States, and it had not objected to having that done. Nevertheless, it closed the river in 1784, and it did so to protect its own colonial interests, its southern colonies, its claims along the Mississippi River. It knew that this would outrage many Americans, and it did outrage many Americans. So in return, Spain offered a trade treaty to the United States, but this trade treaty was very carefully designed to be attractive to northern states, and particularly to New England, and of far less benefit to the southern states. New England, for example, was going to be able to use its own shipping to sell a lot of fish to Spain if the treaty was adopted. But tobacco, which was a major southern export, was excluded from the terms of the treaty. So Spain knew perfectly well that the treaty would be divisive, and in fact the treaty proved extraordinarily divisive. By 1786, John Jay, the American negotiator, Secretary of Foreign Affairs John Jay, was advocating the northern position on the treaty, saying that the United States should accept the closure of the Mississippi River for 25 to 30 years, which would effectively kill Western settlement, in return for obtaining the treaty from Spain. Congress voted on Jay's proposal, and on a pure sectional division, a 7-5 vote, agreed that Jay should be permitted to enter into that kind of treaty. And this essentially froze Congress completely. Congress was really, as a practical matter, after the fall of 1786, only able to act in emergencies. But the most important effect of creating this sectional impasse was that Southern leaders decided that the Confederation was dangerous because they thought the Confederation was selling them out. And consequently, they decided that no new powers should be given to the Confederation. Not tax powers, not commerce powers. Patrick Henry, in particular, became a firm opponent of granting new powers to the Confederation. He personally organized opposition to the Spanish treaty in the Virginia legislature, which unanimously condemned the treaty proposal. So the Spanish treaty impasse became a huge political anchor weighing down the movement for Confederation reform, and was enormously divisive at very little cost to Spain. And James Madison ultimately decided that this had been a deliberate Spanish plot to divide the United States, and clearly, whether he was right that it was a deliberate plot or not, it worked exceptionally well. So by late 1786, the Confederation was completely deadlocked over Western expansion policy, completely unable to do anything to reverse European imperial trade restrictions that were hampering American commerce. And the Western expansion process was going to continue despite the deadlock in ways that made life, from the point of view of many state leaders, worse every day, because it threatened Native American wars, it threatened the need to create a much larger army. And this impasse on expansion, on a deadlock over the course of expansion, became another element and a key element in the political crisis confronting the Confederation. And with that, thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you the next time.